Think your boss is difficult? Try working for Henry VIII. One wrong look, and you'd find yourself facing a drunken executioner with a chipped axe at Tower Hill. The black water of the River Thames moves slowly, heavy and silent, as if it already knows what waits beyond the fog. Rising out of that darkness stands the Tower of London, its stone walls cold, scarred, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Ravens circle above the battlements, their cries cutting through the damp air, while chains scrape against stone, echoing like ghosts that never left. This place is often remembered as a symbol of royal authority, but in the 16th century, it became something far worse. It became a destination designed to erase people. Under the rule of the House of Tudor, the tower shed any remaining illusion of splendor. What was once a fortress and royal residence hardened into a machine of control, and under Henry VIII, it evolved into a permanent threat hanging over the kingdom. Those who entered rarely imagined they would leave alive. The gates opened easily, but once they closed behind you, the tower decided your fate. Velvet banquets and courtly music were replaced by interrogations, silence, and the slow understanding that power here was enforced not by law, but by fear. Even death inside these walls followed a brutal hierarchy. If you were born noble, carrying blue blood and a famous name, you were granted a final privilege, the axe. Beheading was considered swift and controlled. A single decisive blow meant to end suffering quickly and preserve a shred of dignity. It was a death that looked clean, almost orderly. But for those deemed lesser traitors, there was no mercy, only spectacle. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was not meant to kill quickly. It was meant to destroy publicly. The condemned were dragged to the scaffold, hanged until their vision faded, cut open while still conscious, and finally torn apart, their remains displayed as warnings. The body itself became propaganda, a message carved in flesh. Yet even the illusion of mercy could collapse without warning. Inside the tower walls, on the quiet grass of Tower Green, an execution took place that shattered any remaining belief in controlled justice. A 70-year-old woman stepped forward, thin, proud, and unbroken. Her name was Margaret Pole, a woman of royal blood and dangerous lineage. She refused to kneel, declaring she was no criminal and would not bow her head in shame. In that moment, the system faltered. The executioner, young and terrified, swung the axe as she moved. The blade missed her neck and struck her shoulder instead. A scream tore through the air. Bone cracked. Horror spread across the faces of those watching. What followed was chaos. Bleeding and in agony, Margaret tried to flee across the green as the executioner chased her, striking again and again in panic. The axe fell into her back, her head, her body, until she finally collapsed. The grass beneath her darkened with blood. The silence afterward was unbearable, not because it was peaceful, but because it confirmed something far worse. There was no dignity left here, no mercy, only obedience enforced through terror. Death at the Tower of London was never simply the end of a life. It was a performance stage for an audience far beyond these walls. Each execution sent a clear message across England. Loyalty was mandatory, and defiance would be answered with public annihilation. Age offered no protection. Noble blood offered no safety. Even lifelong service meant nothing once the king's suspicion was awakened. And if a ruler could unleash such cruelty on his own kin and closest allies, the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of man did power turn Henry VIII into? And how many lives did it cost before his reign finally ended? Power did not fade from Henry VIII in a single moment. It rotted slowly, painfully, trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed him. Once, he had been the golden prince of Europe. Young, athletic, feared and admired in equal measure, charging through forests on horseback, laughing in tournaments, ruling with charm as much as authority. But by the final decades of his reign, that image had collapsed into something grotesque. His body grew massive and immobile. A festering wound on his leg refused to heal, oozing and burning day and night, a constant source of agony that fed his paranoia. Every step required a cane. Every breath sounded labored, and with every pulse of pain came suspicion, rage, and the certainty that betrayal surrounded him. The court glittered with silk and gold, but beneath the surface it trembled. No one met the king's eyes for too long. No one spoke freely. The The sound of his cane striking stone echoed through the palace like a warning. Music still played, but it felt wrong, almost mocking, as if even the instruments understood that joy had become dangerous. Henry no longer trusted affection. He trusted obedience, and anyone who failed to deliver it, no matter how close, became expendable. Henry loved passionately, but he destroyed without hesitation. To him, marriage was never just intimacy. It was strategy, succession, leverage. And when a wife stopped serving a purpose, she became a liability. And Boleyn learned this truth at the cost of her life. Once the woman who had consumed the king's desire, she became the obstacle blamed for his failures. On the morning of her execution, she walked onto Tower Green wearing dark velvet, composed, almost serene. She knelt in silence as the crowd held its breath. Henry had granted her one final, bitter mercy, a skilled swordsman from France. Instead of a crude axe, a long, gleaming blade flashed through the air, and in a single motion, the woman who had been queen for barely 1,000 days was gone. The rose had been cut cleanly, but it was still blood on the grass. If and faced death with control, Catherine Howard faced it with terror. Young, naive, and hopelessly unprepared for the brutality of court politics, she was consumed by fear as her execution approached. The night before she died, she begged for a block to be brought into her cell so she could practice placing her head correctly, terrified of moving at the wrong moment, terrified of pain. There was no mercy in that preparation, only dread. The king who had once called her his rose without a thorn did not watch her die. He had already erased her. Wives were not the only ones who paid for Henry's instability. Even the men who built his power were never safe. Thomas More, one of the greatest minds of the age, refused to bend his conscience to the king's will. As he climbed the scaffold, calm and smiling, he offered a final line of quiet defiance, asking the executioner to help him up, joking that he would manage the descent himself. It was dignity in its purest form, something Henry could no longer tolerate. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Henry's authority, met a far uglier end. Once indispensable, he fell from favor with terrifying speed. Dragged to Tower Hill, he faced an execution that was anything but clean. The executioner struck again and again, hacking rather than cutting, turning death into a prolonged spectacle of incompetence and cruelty. Whether the result of drunkenness or deliberate neglect, the message was clear. Service offered no protection once the king turned against you. With each signature, Henry erased another life. Orders of execution piled up beneath his hand, written with ink that might as well have been blood. Friends, lovers, advisors, each reduced to a name and a sentence. Under the Tudors, the distance between power and death was impossibly thin. One day you stood at the king's side. The next, you stood at the scaffold. By the end of his life, Henry was alone, surrounded by guards, haunted by memory, trapped inside a failing body. He was said to hear laughter echoing through the corridors of Hampton Court Palace, the ghostly voice of Anne Boleyn following him where no courtier dared. Power had given him everything, and then it stripped him of peace. Yet for many, the king's cruelty did not begin with the axe. Before the scaffold, before the crowd, before death itself, there was something worse. Beneath the tower, in darkness and silence, prisoners were broken long before their final walk into the light. Beneath the White Tower, the stone steps spiraled downward into darkness, slick with moisture and worn smooth by centuries of fear, each step carrying the weight of those who descended knowing they would not return unchanged. The air grows thick and stale, lit only by the weak, trembling glow of a torch that barely touches the walls, revealing stone scarred by iron rings, rust stains, moss, and cobwebs clinging like memories that refuse to fade. Footsteps echo heavily, water drips in slow, merciless rhythm from the ceiling, and somewhere beyond the darkness come sounds that no prison should ever produce. Low moans, the scrape of chains, and sudden screams that erupt and vanish as if swallowed by the earth itself. If the Tower of London was the prison, this chamber was its true heart, a place where truth was not discovered but extracted, where light did not reach and hope dissolved into pain. At the center of one damp room stood the rack, a crude wooden frame fitted with leather straps and iron chains, simple in design and devastating in effect. A body was bound at both ends, wrists and ankles locked in place, while a torturer turned the handle with steady patience. The ropes tightened, muscles stretched beyond their limits. Then came the sound that haunted survivors for life. The dry, cracking snap of joints tearing loose, the wet rip of ligaments giving way, followed by screams that no human voice was meant to produce. Pain here was not sudden. It was deliberate, prolonged, and methodical, designed to dismantle the body inch by inch until the mind followed. On this machine suffered an Askew, a young Protestant woman whose resolve became legend. Even as her shoulders and hips were torn from their sockets, even as her body collapsed into something barely human, she refused to renounce her faith or name accomplices. When they finally untied her, she could not stand. She had to be carried to her execution, broken in body but undefeated in will, a reminder that pain could destroy flesh without conquering belief. Where the rack stretched its victims outward, another device crushed them inward. Known chillingly as the scavenger's daughter, it was a curved iron frame shaped like an A, fitted with clamps that forced the body into a grotesque fold. Knees were driven into the chest, the spine bent, iron pressed against flesh until breath itself became an enemy. Blood seeped from noses, eyes, even beneath fingernails as pressure forced it out from within. Bones creaked, teeth clenched, lungs struggled for air. This was not the tearing agony of the rack, but something slower and more suffocating. The sensation of being collapsed into oneself, organs compressed, life squeezed from the inside. Victims often lost consciousness not from mercy, but from the sheer inability of the body to endure any longer. Sometimes, torture required no elaborate machine at all. Iron manacles were locked around a prisoner's wrists, chains hoisted upward until the body hung suspended, toes barely brushing the ground or lifted entirely into the air. The full weight of the body pulled downward on swollen joints, cutting circulation, tearing muscles, numbing hands until they blackened and failed. Each involuntary twitch set the chains rattling, a metallic reminder that gravity itself had become the executioner. Hours passed. Muscles gave out. Consciousness faded and returned in waves of agony. The body begged for rest that never came. None of this was random cruelty. Torture inside the tower followed rules, cold and bureaucratic. Every session required a warrant, signed by royal authority or the Privy Council. The goal was never immediate death. It was information, names, confessions, networks of betrayal real or imagined. Once the victim broke, once the words were spoken or the signature placed upon the page, their fate was sealed. One of the most infamous examples lies in the trembling handwriting of Guy Fawkes, whose once firm signature collapsed into a distorted scrawl after days on the rack, physical proof of a will systematically dismantled. These chambers did not merely imprison bodies. They erased certainty, dignity, and resistance. The screams that echoed through these stones were not accidents of history. They were tools of governance. Power under the Tudors did not rely on loyalty alone. It relied on fear refined into an institution. And for those who survived the darkness below, the ordeal was not yet over. If torture did not kill them, the tower still demanded its final performance. One last journey into the light, where punishment would no longer be hidden underground, but displayed for all to see. Gray smoke settles over Smithfield like a suffocating veil, blurring the edges of the square until iron stakes rise from the ground like blackened ribs, each surrounded by bundles of dry wood and straw stacked with deliberate care. There is no scaffold here, no swift blade, only fire prepared in advance. Flames crackle and spit as they catch, their glow reflecting in the unblinking eyes of Mary I, watching from above in heavy black velvet, fingers tightening around a Catholic rosary as Latin prayers roll through the air in low, relentless chants. The crowd murmurs, some whispering prayers of their own, others crying softly, while smoke thickens until sky and ground seem to merge into a single color of ash. Mary does not see herself as a butcher. In her mind, she is a healer. England, as she understands it, is diseased, corrupted by Protestantism, poisoned by her father's break with Rome. Fire, to her, is medicine. She believes it can cauterize the wound. Raised in humiliation after Henry VIII cast aside her mother and stripped Mary of her status, She grew up clinging to faith as the only thing that could not be taken from her. When she finally seized the crown, restoring Catholicism was not policy. It was revenge sanctified by belief. Every flame was an act of devotion, every death a step toward salvation. The condemned are chained to iron stakes, thick links biting into flesh as priests murmur last rites. Some families, desperate for mercy where none officially exists, secretly hang small bags of gunpowder around their loved ones' necks, praying the explosion will come quickly once the fire climbs high enough. It is a final, illegal kindness, meant to spare them from being slowly roasted alive as skin blisters, lungs fill with smoke, and screams dissolve into hoarse silence. When the torches touch the straw, the fire spreads fast, licking upward, wrapping bodies in heat and light, while prayers turn into cries and then into nothing at all. With every execution, Mary believes she is restoring order. But outside the palace walls, something unexpected is happening. The flames are not extinguishing Protestant belief. They are feeding it. Each victim becomes a symbol, each death a story whispered from house to house. When Hugh Latimer stands beside Nicholas Ridley as the fire is lit beneath them, Latimer's voice cuts through the smoke with a calm that terrifies more than screams ever could. He tells his companion to be brave, to light a candle in England that will never be put out. The crowd listens. They remember, and belief hardens instead of breaking. As bodies burn, people in the square dip handkerchiefs into blood and ash, pressing them to their chests as relics. These are no longer criminals to be forgotten. They are martyrs. Their names spread faster than fear ever did, carried by word of mouth and, later, by ink. In the years that follow, a book appears, its pages heavy with testimony and flame-stained memory, Fox's Book of Martyrs, recording nearly 300 executions under Mary's reign. The Queen's intent is buried beneath the weight of these stories, replaced by a name that history will never let go: Bloody Mary. 5 years. That is all the time she has. 5 years, nearly 300 burned alive, and a kingdom more divided than ever. When illness finally takes Mary, she dies isolated and defeated, knowing that her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth I will inherit the throne and dismantle everything she fought to restore. The fires go out. The policies are reversed. The faith she tried to erase returns stronger than before, and Mary's legacy becomes inseparable from smoke and screaming. Today, Smithfield is quiet. A small plaque marks the ground where bodies once burned for belief, a fragile reminder of what happens when power confuses conviction with cruelty. Mary tried to save England's soul with fire, but fire only illuminated the cost. It could destroy flesh, blacken bone, and scar a nation, but it could not burn belief away. And as blood and flame consumed the Tudor dynasty from within, another woman, watching carefully from the shadows of the tower, learned a different lesson entirely. Survival did not always belong to the faithful or the ruthless, but to the patient. Tower Hill holds its breath. The wind cuts across the scaffold, sharp enough to sting, and the crowd stands in a silence so complete it feels unnatural. At the center of it all is a man named Derek, a former criminal who should have died on a rope, but was spared to serve the crown as an executioner. His hands shake as he grips the axe, not because he fears death, but because today the man kneeling before him is the very person who once saved his life. Robert Devereux had pulled Derek from the gallows and turned him into an instrument of royal justice. And now fate has twisted that mercy into a curse that no man could endure without breaking. The axe rises, then falls and fails. The blade glances off instead of biting deep. A roar of shock tears through the crowd. Derek swings again, panic overtaking skill, but once more the strike goes wrong. Essex cries out, the sound raw and human, and the crowd erupts in fury. Stones and curses fly through the air. Only on the third blow does the head finally separate from the body, rolling across the wood as blood soaks the platform. Derek stands frozen, drenched in the life of his benefactor, while the people rain down their hatred upon him. In a bitter twist of history, his name will outlive his crime, borrowed centuries later to describe the skeletal cranes that lift the dead weight of cities skyward, a mechanical echo of the gallows that once defined him. While axes fall in public, survival inside the palace demands a different kind of precision. Catherine Parr learns this lesson when death comes not as a blade, but as parchment. In her private chambers, candlelight flickers across a royal warrant bearing the king's seal, an order for her arrest. Her breath catches. Her knees give way. For a moment, terror threatens to overwhelm her. She knows what happens to queens accused of heresy. She knows the path from bedroom to tower is short. But Catherine does not run. She understands something others never did. With Henry VIII, flight is guilt. She steadies herself, smooths her gown, and walks straight into the king's chamber, where Henry VIII lies trapped inside his decaying body, groaning as pain radiates from the open wound in his leg. His voice is thick with suspicion as he questions her learning, her conversations, her interest in theology. Catherine does not argue. She kneels. She lowers her voice. She tells him she speaks of religion only to distract him from pain, that she is a foolish woman seeking guidance from a mind far greater than her own. She praises his wisdom. She shrinks herself so he can feel vast again. Slowly, the king's anger melts into satisfaction. He laughs. He believes he has been obeyed. And just like that, death retreats, defeated not by innocence, but by intelligence. The danger, however, is not over. Power has allies eager to finish what suspicion began. In the gardens, as Henry and Catherine walk together, Stephen Gardiner approaches with a detachment of guards, chains in hand, ready to arrest the queen. But he miscalculates the king's mood. Henry's rage explodes without warning. He slams his cane into the ground and unleashes a torrent of abuse, calling Gardiner a fool, a beast, a disgrace, ordering him to vanish before his own head replaces another on the scaffold. The guards scatter. Gardiner retreats in humiliation. Catherine remains standing, composed on the surface, shaken beneath it, fully aware that she has just survived by a margin thinner than breath. The camera pulls away from the palace and returns to the tower, drifting past severed heads mounted on spikes along London Bridge, grim punctuation marks in the skyline. Then it settles on a young girl watching from a distance, absorbing every lesson this bloody world offers. Her name is Elizabeth I, and she is alive because Catherine Parr protected her, because someone finally learned how to survive Henry VIII without challenging him. Elizabeth sees the pattern clearly. In Tudor England, law offers no shield. Morality offers none. Only restraint, patience, and mastery of language stand between life and annihilation. The Tudor dynasty is remembered as a golden age, but it was forged in fear. Executioners bungled their work. Queens burned. Advisors were butchered. Survival belonged not to the righteous, but to the perceptive. Henry ruled by rage. Mary ruled by fire. And those who lived long enough learned that power did not reward loyalty, love, or truth. It rewarded submission and strategy. Catherine Parr escaped not because she was innocent, but because she understood the monster on the throne. And from the shadows of that terror, a new kind of ruler was born, one who would never forget what it cost to stay alive in a kingdom where words could save you, and silence could kill you just as quickly. The sun sinks low over the River Thames, turning the water a deep, burning red as the camera drifts past the wooden stakes lining London Bridge, each one crowned with a skull bleached by time, hollow eyes staring toward a horizon they will never reach. Their shadows stretch long across the river in the dying light, merging with the rippling current as if blood and water have finally become one. This is the cost hidden beneath England's most famous skyline, a reminder that power here was never gentle, never clean, and never free. The image fades, slowly, almost mercifully, and from the ghosts of severed heads emerges a different vision. Elizabeth I, crowned in gold and white, radiant and composed, the living symbol of a new beginning. Under her rule, England will rise, command a seas, and enter an age history will later call glorious. But glory does not erase what came before it. It stands on top of it. The Tudor dynasty ends in triumph, but it was built layer by layer with discarded lives, with wives silenced and erased, with trusted advisors dragged to the scaffold, with executioners whose trembling hands turned death into spectacle, with screams that never reached the throne room, echoing instead through the stone corridors of the tower. History remembers the crown, the victories, the empire. It rarely lingers on the cost paid by those who never wore velvet, never held power, and never survived suspicion. The foundations of this kingdom were not laid only with stone and ambition. They were cemented with fear, with fire at Smithfield, with iron in underground chambers, with blades raised again and again until obedience was absolute. The names of kings and queens endure, carved into monuments and textbooks, but the soul of England was shaped just as deeply by the nameless, by those reduced to ashes, shadows, and silence. As the light finally fades, a distant bell begins to toll from Westminster Abbey, its sound rolling softly across the city before dissolving into the wind. Ravens cry once more, the same sound that opened this story, closing the circle at last. And as the screen darkens, one truth remains, impossible to ignore. Empires rise on victories, but they are remembered by what they were willing to sacrifice to achieve them. In memory of the souls lost at the Tower of London between 1485 and 1603. Thank you for listening. And if these hidden stories behind royal glory stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us, because the past still has many dark truths waiting to be uncovered.